A couple weeks ago at Harvard, Brenda Croft, the Australian Aboriginal art historian, had a wonderful conference, and one of the things she asked us to do was each person got 5 slides with 5 images, and these were supposed to introduce ourselves. I did this, but it turned out I didn't actually have to do it. So I had this PowerPoint here to introduce myself, and so I'm following the lead of Brenda Croft, which was basically an encouragement to us to take intellectual projects that we had done over the course of our careers and use them to frame issues and questions that we were interested in. So this is the first picture. When I was a teaching fellow for Bill Cronin's environmental history class, you know, there's this one too. Is that better? Oh, so much better. So this is a picture that goes all the way back to my graduate student days. I was a teaching fellow for Bill Cronin's environmental history class. He put this picture up. I turned to my colleague, Gunther Peck, next to me and said, this weird thing about like white people dressing up like Indians, you know, that's kind of odd. And he's like, oh my God, I just saw this Improved Order of Red Men Lodge in Iowa this summer, and suddenly flashed into my mind this long tradition of non-native people dressing up like Indian people. So this picture is actually kind of the thing that represents really my first scholarly project, which was my dissertation and then my first book, Playing Indian. And I think it raises this question about sort of the structural and systematic kind of settler appropriations of nativeness, both sort of imagined and ideological, but also investigated in ethnographic kinds of contexts. What does this mean? I made a lot of arguments in this book about its nationalist and its modernist kinds of inclinations. So there's my first picture. My second picture is a famous picture of Geronimo in a locomobile, not in a Cadillac, but the inspiration for Michael Martin Murphy's song, Geronimo's Cadillac, and many other kinds of things. This is really the picture that structured my second project, Indians in Unexpected Places, in which I tried to look at Native people doing things at the moment of the early 20th, late 19th, early 20th century around the question of modernity, not really modernism. I wasn't thinking about art so much, but I was thinking about the modern as a philosophical strategy and thinking about modernity as a social, cultural, political kind of condition. And it raises this question, which looks like a little hard to see, but questions about modernity and the ways that Native people have engaged that discourse of the modern and about modernity, which is something that I think is a non-Native preoccupation. Colonialism tends to bother Native people more, tended to be the sort of point of thought at this moment, right? But Native people seeing, perceiving, and moving within these questions about what modernity may or may not have been. This picture is the most mundane picture ever. It's one of those things that you can find in any local historical society. A guy took his camera and set it up on the main street of a town and took a picture, and it doesn't seem to actually tell us much, but in fact, these pictures, when read properly, I think are incredibly revealing. So this is Boulder, city of Boulder in 1907. There's all kinds of things to be learned here about sewer systems and streetcars and dogs and wagons and why a building that's 3 stories tall and why trees in the middle of a town and these kinds of things. And this is a methodological practice then for me that took shape in this sort of third book about American studies, questions about method. And really drawn from material culture studies, I kind of learned how to think from this guy, Jules Prown, who had basically taken an art historical method and sort of applied it to material culture studies. And so this was sort of one of my primary ways of thinking about interpretation, which has been a really important thing for me. For me, the sort of family history and family story and family legacy has always been really important. My great-great Sassuet, François Deslauriers, standing here in 1867 in front of the White House. You know, so the family story has always been really important to me, as I'm sure many of you know. My dad, Vine Deslauriers Jr., really kind of bequeathed to me a certain kind of legacy of thinking about these questions. And that's really taken shape in the project that I just finished in 2019 on my great aunt Mary Sully, also known as Susan Deloria, who did these amazing works of art between the late 1920s and the mid-1940s, and this was the subject of that particular book. So questions about sort of how to read this, I tried to retool myself as not an art historian, but an art adjacent person is how I've been describing myself. I feel like I've kind of engaged art to the point where I've reached the moment of imposter syndrome, where it's like I'm really not an art historian or an art critic, but in fact, I've sort of pushed myself far enough into this domain that Jeffrey Gibson keeps asking me to do stuff. So so it is a methodological kind of moment for me, right, of like reverse engineering that material culture studies kind of origin that I had back into the art history origin that Jules Prown had when he was thinking about material culture studies, and doing a kind of idiosyncratic, I think, kind of art historical or critical sort of practice that's inflected by Native American studies in these different kinds of ways. And I just had to also throw this in and sort of, you know, snaps to my friend Karen Kramer from the Peabody Essex. So in the T.C. Cannon exhibition, you know, the first thing that I was struck by was first a picture of my great-great-grandfather there, but also T.C. Cannon's Martin 0018 guitar, which Karen was nice enough to let me play. And the restoration on this guitar is fantastic. It's a beautiful and wonderful guitar as a material object, right, as a spiritual object in ways that guitars actually are. It's a really, really wonderful thing. And so for some reason, you know, playing this guitar inspired me to write a bit more about music. And suddenly I found myself being asked to do these sort of music critical kinds of things. I'm giving the keynote at the American Musicological Society in 3 weeks. Why, I do not know. But it's led to this sort of like writing about particularly country music and folk music and guitars and things like that. So I feel like I've suddenly moved my life into a different sort of space as being a kind of music and art engaged sort of person. And then I was really felt incredibly lucky to be able to, Jeffrey, to have a piece in the Indigenous Present book. And this is this sort of moment where Beth Piatot and I were chatting about the trickster hermeneutic of the 1980s and where did it go? It just disappeared, this tricksterism. But this to me is sort of my trickster moment because, you know, in this catalog, in this book of like the best, most amazing art coming out of Native America, I slipped this in, which is my own little thing that I did one night, cackling in great delight, this sort of imagined story of Walter Benjamin sort of trying to make his way across the Pyrenees and running into this native figure, Charging Elk, who I borrowed from James Welch's last novel, who helps Benjamin across the Pyrenees and sort of takes his suitcase to LA to meet with Theodore Adorno, and sort of like fusing together the tradition of Native people in Wild West shows with a sort of high gloss German theory of the mid 20th century. And so I feel a little trickstery, you know, to have this image there. So it, I think, raises these questions, particularly about futurity and futurism, about moving beyond what would, for me, be as a historian, the counterfactual. I've done some counterfactual work, which is really kind of fun, and beyond the critical fabulation sort of tradition of Saija Hartman and others, into thinking about sort of you know, how we interact, you know, as Native cultural producers. I'm going to claim that tiniest little piece of Native American cultural production kind of thing with markets, consumers, culture makers, shapers, all of these kinds of questions. What does futurity look like? Does it just look like kind of graphic arts and science fiction? Can it look like other sorts of things? This is my own little kind of gesture, you know, in that direction. And then, you know, this has been sort of the defining moment of my life for the last, you know, couple years is sort of watching the work of Mary Sully come to fruition in the show at the Met, Mary Sully, Native Modern. You know, which is just really kind of has me floating on a cloud and has been for a long time. It's, as I often say, like it's not often you can do something for your ancestors. I've actually had a chance to do it twice. My dad, when he passed, left behind a manuscript, a reader's report, and a book contract, and I kind of was able to take his book to fruition. And now with my great aunt Mary Sully to sort of like, when she died in 1963, there's no way she would have ever imagined that the art she was making, you know, privately in her room would be on the walls of the Met. I mean, it's just kind of an amazing thing. So I feel very honored and privileged, but also, this is the best project of my life and my career, and that's because of her, not because of me, right? It's because of the genius of her as a, you know, as a Native artist. And in particular, the ways that I think she really surfaces for us the importance of Native women as sort of central art producers and under-acknowledged art producers across this long kind of, you know, tradition. So, this to me then, this exhibit raises these questions about museums and art markets and market differentiations and these things that I don't really know very much about, but seem to be really quite important to the conversations that we're having today. My dad at one point had sort of theorized, along with Suzanne Harjo and others, right, that like non-native interest in native people had a cyclical kind of sort of line, right? And every 25 years or 30 years, it would crest, and there would be this moment, and there would be opportunities for people, and then it would crash, and then it would be sort of sitting there for a long time, and then it would raise again, and and it may be that the cycle's increasing in its speed, or it may be that we're reaching these kind of plateaus, and we're building, upward, and it's, I think, an open question about how to think about those things, and maybe it's one of the things that we chat a little bit about today. And then finally, I feel really lucky to have been able to write at least a little bit of commentary about the pavilion, and it seems to me that we also have questions to think about there about how we begin together the process of a kind of critical history and memory practice around this event, the place that we're at right now. It's prehistory in terms of Venice and other kinds of places, its meanings, its interiors, its dreamings, its futurities, its artistic and aesthetic unconscious, and whatever the now and next actually looks like. So this is my riff.
Thank you. Thank you, Bill. Thank you very much, Bill. I'm going to call up Tim next, yeah. Tim, would you like to join us at the podium to present on behalf of Jolene and introduce yourself?
Twaskanaha, Ikiskarura, Accessua Aquaya, Fahakera, Chakwa Suhaha, Disna, Ohada Ehwat, Neu Chatned. Greetings, my name is Tim McKee. I'm dear clan of the Tuskara Nation. I'm Jolene Rickard's husband. This morning we were on our way here and she wasn't feeling well, so we turned back, and so you'll have to bear with me. A few minutes later, she said, "You're going to have to make this presentation for me." So this will be the second time I'm reading this, so again, bear with me, and these are her words, not mine. Okay. Bonjour and greetings. I hope you are all well. My name is Yachiniti, Jolene Rickard. I am of the Turtle Clan from the Tuskara Nation, which is part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, with their lands ranging from the Carolinas to northern Ontario in the settler state of Canada in the United States. Many thanks to the organizers and Jeffrey Gibson for the invitation to be part of history. A panel titled Future Making should be a productive space to consider what are the makers of future making, specifically for American, Indian, Native American, First Nation, and Indigenous peoples. As an art historian with deep roots in curation and photography, I am always thinking about time. I'm struck with the extraction of indigenous knowledge within the environmental movement. I'm observing that Western philosophers and theorists are struggling to understand the agency of other than human beings, yet I am respectful of all the thought makers willing to engage in public spaces, especially the potential of what Jeffrey Gibson's work in the American Pavilion at the 60th Venice Biennale signals. As part of the Indigenous Futures Dialogue, I find Gerald Visner's popularizing the survivance and insightful making of an aspect of Native American time as transmotion, coupled with Leanne Simpson's and Glenn Cohart's land relationship termed grounded normativity, creates a foundation to consider indigenous constructions of reality. These literary and indigenous studies influenced theories complement the contemporary work of indigenous arts. I argue it's the artists that first challenged decolonize space, then imagine anti-colonial future. Next line. In less than 5 minutes, I would like to envision the indigenous cosmography through our relationships, the materiality of the anodate bead that connects our past to the future. The Haudenosaunee have a customary practice called Ganonyo, or words before all else, that focuses our minds and our interconnectedness and responsibilities to each other. The foundational core of the field of Indigenous studies and Native American history is expressed as ethical responsibility within industrial cultures, as place-based knowledge and reciprocity. According to sociologist and myself, and Haudenosaunee Anishinaabe scholar Vanessa Watts, place thought is based upon the premise that the land is alive and thinking, and non-humans derive agency through the extension of these thoughts. These ideas were so important to the wellness of Haudenosaunee peoples that the act of stringing together bead-like materials to conform profound ideas echo back the formation of the Haudenosaunee aspirational goal of seeking a greater good, or skana, or peace. This idea based on the white pine and visual, the materialized in wampum beads as wampum belts, the ever-growing tree, the wing or dust belt. The late Sam Thomas reimagined this movement in the aesthetic of the 1800s Tuscarora raised beadwork. The idea of indigenous futures, labor, economies, arts could be based on the ingenuity of Tuscarora and Haudenosaunee artisans, strategic observation of Victorian taste, the tourist market and North America in the 1800s, and the culturally established affinity for the bead. As co-curator for Across Borders beadwork in Iroquois life, thousands of pieces of Tuscarora and Haudenosaunee beadwork were found in archives throughout North America and Europe. The exhibition, contextualized by cosmological narratives and the photographic archive record, repositioned beadwork as an agential force in indigenous future making. She had a stereo. The culmination of the role of this beadwork and part of our economic and cultural survival was personal for me, and because my collated photograph, the shadow of the glitter bug falls on her cheek, my great-grandmother Flossie, survivor of the Hampton boarding school, wife of William Chew, Bear Clan, Royane, was also a beadwork artist, selling at the New York State Fair in Indian Village in the 1940s. This example or case study could apply to almost all Native American art post our land disposition and forced removal. Yep, there's this great law gifting. And then this one is, in the 1800s, it was some form of this making that made our future. I argue that the materiality of beads took on a different role in the early 20th century. Increased literacy about wampum and wampum belts and the renewed intent of wampum belts as building diplomatic relationships has been evoked by the Haudenosaunee as we continue to assert our sovereignty and nationhood. My grandfather, Beaver Clan Royane Clinton Rickard, was at the forefront of the resistance of the U.S.-Canadian border that divided our land and the rejection of imposed U.S. citizenship. It's difficult to imagine now, but to stand up against the U.S. and Canadian governments meant incarceration. The settler states of Canada and the United States were practicing interference in our traditional governance. It has been 100 years since Gayakono Riane Diskahe, Levi General Gehat, was bundled by the Haudenosaunee and sent to the League of Nations in Geneva, Switzerland, to assert our right to speak on our own behalf. Native people from North America have a long history of sending diplomatic emissaries to treat with European colonizing governments. The journey taken by Diskahe is part of our continuum was the focus of my latest curatorial intervention in the United Nations in Geneva, Switzerland in 1923. The 60-panel exhibition along the palisade next to the Lake Geneva chronicled the Haudenosaunee call for recognition as a nation in the arena of modern nation states. It's important that we recognize that the traditional governance of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy reject the U.S. and Canadian legal definition of being a domestic, dependent, or quasi-sovereign tribe. Central to this assertion was the role that wampum belts play in staking our right of self-determination and sovereignty. It's been 100 years since Diskahe Levi General Gehat went to Geneva, and in 2023, the Riane Diskahe, Stephen Jacobs, rekindled the relationship with the citizens of the city of Geneva. Citizens, because like former League of Nations and now United Nations, Native American and Indigenous people can only speak through a third-party host organization or nation. We have not been victorious in the recognition of nation states as an equal. Why share this history? The arts are central in the worlding process. Indigenous peoples globally live in the strike zones of the climate crisis. We all live in the age of end-stage capitalism, the mechanism of the United Nations. One of the only forums for people to seek justice has proven ineffective against war and climate degradation. So gains have been made, but it's the 21st century site of repair, restitution, and reconciliation for Indigenous peoples and nations. What's next? Is art and material culture anticipatory? Where does change happen? Is it possible that Jeffrey Gibson's takeover of the U.S. Pavilion has challenged to consider the space in which the place to be, space in which to place me will be realized in 100 years in an Indigenous future present. I assert that art does have an emissary role as diplomats of the 21st century, and in this context, the assemblage of exuberant beaded artworks and colors that embrace the vibrancy of the living earth anticipate the future as Indigenous. Now.
Thank you. Thank you, Tim. Thank you. Carolyn Monet is going to present next.
Kwe kakina, tanjiki chiminenda nindi nongum. I'm very honored to have been invited to partake in this gathering and be part of this panel today. I'm a visual artist and a filmmaker. My studio is based in Montreal. I have quite a broad multidisciplinary practice, so in 5 minutes it will be hard to go over it all, but I'll do a quick overview. I'm Anishinaabe on my mother's side from Kiriganzibi, which is a community north of Ottawa, and I'm also French on my father's side from the west coast of Brittany, France. And from the beginning of my practice, I've been interested in how we impact and shape the environment we live in, and how in return that environment influences everything that we are. I grew up between two continents and cultures, so ideas of duality are very present in my work. I like to look at how boundaries, real or imagined, shape our cultures and communities, and I'm really interested in stories embedded in the structures of the world around us. So in 2018, we always say that identity is intrinsic to territory, but I question what happens when you belong to two distinct territories. So in 2018, I decided to cross the Atlantic Ocean by boat to find a middle ground for both sides of my ancestors to meet. And on one hand is the promise of a new life. It takes courage to leave a country behind and start a new life in a new foreign land, but it's also a site of ongoing colonial movement and economic exchange between Europe and North America. Colonization is defined by the transatlantic slave trade and the genocide of my ancestors and indigenous people in North America. So through the work, I want to challenge colonial organization of land, time, and bodies, and also looking into how communication can be a bridge, or can bridge vast psychological and physical divides. When we strip people of their original toponymy and territories, we remove their social, political, cultural, and spiritual references. Land is fragmented and divided. Forests are burned down to make space for agriculture, forcing my ancestors and many families to migrate and opt for a sedentary lifestyle. These works are actually fire etching on wood panels, so referencing these indelible marks left on ancestral land and families in the name of progress. And the design I make reference directly these marks on the land, but they're also inspired by traditional Anishinaabe designs, often found on regalia and birch bark baskets. I like to integrate the birch bark biting technique into my work, which very known to Kiriganzibi community, to Algonquin people, and this really allows me to bring complex symmetry and geometry in the work. I use the computer to make these designs. They start resemble QR codes and city mappings, as much as remaining true to the weaving and beading that inspired them in the first place. And I never repeat the same design twice. So they really evolve as a language over time, or a society would evolve across generations. They act as a microchip, or I hope they can act as a microchip to transfer knowledge across generation, and hoping to offer a glimpse back and a path forward. Through my research around land and habitat, I started experimenting with building materials. And also, my parents used to build homes, so I grew up surrounded by these materials. Growing up, would go back home after school, and my room was pink, but it was actually insulating foam. So I do like to look at the materials and the lack of vision that we have a lot across many Indigenous communities across Canada. In remote regions with harsh winters, construction materials can be scarce and extremely expensive. And we know that under the Indian Act, the Canadian government has tried to strip Indigenous communities of any autonomy over their living conditions. So I believe that we should treat homes as living bodies. because I'm convinced that cheap building materials where lingering moisture creates mold could affect your physical, mental, but also emotional and spiritual health. And this is a piece with black mold that colonizes the gypsum boards called Havoc. And through techniques usually associated with textile practices such as embroidery, weaving, patterns, embellishments, I try to elevate these basic materials and show through every gesture a vibrant homage to indigenous resilience, tradition, and brilliance. Every surface for me is potential for ornament. Parallel to my studio practice, I've been working on a photography series that I started 2016, where I invite Francophone Indigenous women to pose as a family portrait. And through that work, I tried to resist the negative representation of Indigenous women conveyed in the media. The women I photograph look directly at the camera. They break away from the colonial representation, the anthropological representation, Eurocentric, and often very male gaze that was used in the past. I want to put these bodies back in our cities, in our lives, in our families, in our imagination. These women's demand to be heard and seen. Who are these women? Why do they demand to be heard and seen? They are leaders, they're community builders, they're eccentric and elegant and resilient. They're proud to be Indigenous, they hold the future in their arms. And often I approach these photography series as a film set, so there's a lot of people involved in making these photographs, and we build community through the process of making these works. And overall, through my work, I hope to create an experience that can trigger a deeper understanding of Indigenous lived experiences, create new possibilities for social justice and equality. Kichimigwich.
Thank you, Carolyn. Philip, if you'd like to join us. I believe we're kind of standing by to see if Jolene will join us on a video call, so we'll just be flexible for that, but we can start the conversation. And again, I wanted just to thank Jolene's husband, Tim, for joining us and speaking on behalf. Before we get started with the conversation, I just wanted to introduce my practice and why I think I'm here moderating the panel. My name is Ginger Donnell. I am the creator and host of Broken Boxes podcast. Broken Boxes is an artist-run, independent broadcasting platform amplifying narratives of complexity, solidarity, contradiction, and inspiration in the arts. I launched it in 2014, so I'm celebrating my 10-year anniversary of the project, which is pretty phenomenal for a podcast because they weren't really around 10 years ago. So I kind of used it as an art form to experiment with archiving stories of my peers. One thing I wanted to share about my practice is it's a long-form interview podcast, and it reflects the vulnerability and strength of the artist while acknowledging the many variations of an artist's practiced values, including those of the activist, advocate, disruptor, and cultural activator, and cultural adjacent people as well, and artist adjacent people as well. So I'm really honored to be here. I was very nervous to moderate a panel in such a prestigious space, but just seeing so many friends over the past 48 hours and meeting new friends has really grounded me and made me feel kind of invincible in a way that you don't always feel when you travel across the world. So I just wanted to thank everyone here for showing up, and thank you, Jeffrey, and the whole team that surrounds you. There's a space of love here that you don't feel often. So that's my first moment. And then I want to start with asking Philip a question. And you can add on to it if you feel. Let's see. I was trying to prepare because I feel I feel like I need to be very professional. Sometimes I fly off the cuff a little, and I like to have fun with my conversations, but I want to ground us and start by grounding us in place. And Philip, can you reflect a bit on the title of Jeffrey's activation here, The Place in Which to Place Me, and how these words, this body of work, may consider a reaction to and conversation with the imperial colonial landscape we find ourselves within?
Well, the title is, the title is so stunning, and of course, all of us who are in love with Layli Long Soldier's poetry, are always grooving to this sort of sense. I mean, for me, the space and place dynamic is a really central one to thinking about colonialism and its history. That, in every colonial encounter, there's a placedness, right, that we can think of as being in the indigenous, right, place names and land that has spirit. And the colonizing project is to sort of deplace that, right, replace that. But first, before you can replace it, you have to deplace it. And I think that deplacing is turning it into something called space, right? A sort of like amorphous, unnamed, untitled kind of space, which is then amenable to being replaced and renamed and restoried in all the kinds of ways that we've seen happen. So the space in which to place me asks us, I think, to think through what that dynamic looks like. And for me, I mean, I'm not a person who's ever been to the Venice Biennale before, and so just wandering through the pavilions, I mean, I was really struck by the kind of colonial feeling of the place, actually. I mean, here we are in Venice, right, the home of the glass trade bead, so there's a kind of meta sort of colonial sort of context for being in Venice itself, but for example, the British Pavilion, I mean, for me, it was really striking, right? This enormous neo-colonial kind of building on the top of a sort of hillish rise. I mean, that sort of, in some ways, just speaks to the kind of history of modern colonialism. And the French building pretty close by, and then, the American building next to it. And so, some part of it, it feels to me, is sort of like this we recognize as a colonial space in and of itself. And I think part of what my sense of Jeffrey doing is sort of like interacting with that place, making it into a space in which one could place oneself, right? And to do that then in the context of the American Pavilion itself, I think is a sort of third layer to that, right? That the American Pavilion is itself a neoclassical kind of building. And I think in the context of thinking about American colonialism, neoclassicism has very specific kinds of meanings, right? It is the sort of first great American post-independence kind of project of replacing across the landscape, And I think Jolene would certainly have more things to say about this than I, but the Clinton-Sullivan campaign during the Revolutionary War devastates New York State, what will become New York State, devastates Haudenosaunee territory. And what happens when that actually is going through the process of becoming a state? It is a neoclassicizing exercise in replacing Haudenosaunee names with neoclassical names. Ithaca, Sparta, all of those kind of Greco-Roman things, right? This was the classic kind of. So for me, sort of to think like, what does a neoclassical building look like and what does it say? It says a lot about a colonial kind of past and the choice of the architects and the people who put this building together in the 1930s, in 1930, as I recall, just feels like yet another kind of thing. So it's not only, I think, the sort of placing oneself within Venice, within the Biennale, but within the building itself, and thus I think the sort of, the wrapping of the building, the sort of the color of the sort of exuberant color of the building. I mean, there's a joy in that, to be sure, but I think there's also kind of an aggressiveness about claiming space and place within that kind of context. And, you know, I mean, Patsy Phillips is here, and she just did a wonderful sort of chat a couple weeks ago and taught me much about the history of the Biennale. But I think it's really important to note, right, that building dates to 1930. The people who put it together were the private people, the Grand Central Galleries, who in 31 would then sort of host the Exposition of Native American Arts, which then came to the Biennale in 32. Right, and this is the moment, right? Merriam Report in 1928. I mean, this is the moment of classic Indian reform and moving into what will be the neo-imperial project of the Indian Reorganization Act. So the very fact of that building in its not only spatial sense, but its temporal sense is also part of this kind of history of colonialism. So I think sort of, to me, my sense is, my guess is, being a Native artist, walking into that building, walking into this space, that one had to have a kind of reaction to like, how do I take this? You know, how do I make this the place or the space in which to place me, right? And so, and then I think it points to the question about like, what is the me? And I think this is one of the great sort of mysteries of the pavilion that maybe we can chat more about, right? I mean, there's I think the temptation to sort of make it about the individual artist, right? About the artist's subjectivity, the place to place me, but also the representational politics that go with this. The me being a Native me and an American me, right? The obligation to represent in multiple kinds of forms. So, you know, for me, it's what makes the pavilion kind of such a delight, is to sort of meditate on the ways in which this colonial and colonized space has actually been sort of seized and reclaimed and problematized and made productive.
Thank you. Thank you. It looks like we have Jolene on the line. I'd like to pose a question towards Jolene, but also, Jolene, if you have any reflections on that after I pose my question, you're welcome to hop in. So Jolene, you're a leader in comparative understandings of global indigenous art, and many look to your work around multiple sovereignties as a guide for deeper understanding. Will you share a bit more about how you are expanding this ethos through your work and how you see others activating multiple sovereignties in the arts? Oh, you have to unmute yourself just in case. Let's see. Well, maybe if anybody else wants to speak to what, yeah.
So for me, the title, A Space in Which to Place Me, for me feels like a call to, well, first a call to creating a sense of belonging, but also a call to getting rid of all the labels that we're often being put into as artists. Especially when you have a multidisciplinary practice, people ask you, well, are you a filmmaker or are you a visual artist? And I always say, why can I be both? People want you to decide usually to choose one discipline. Are you working textile or more installation? And I feel it's the medium it's the message that dictates the medium that you choose. You don't have to be only one thing, or identities are multiple. Often people want to put you in the label of being an artist, a filmmaker, a francophone, a woman, but you can be all of these things and exist as a whole of many parts, which I think is what Jeffrey's trying to do, also with bringing different people from different backgrounds and different experiences, creating a common experience, but celebrating that richness of diversity within that community.
Hi, Ginger.
Hi,
Can you hear me?
Jolene. Yeah, thank you for joining us.
Good morning, everybody. Apologies for not being in the room. To address Ginger's prompt, I think the notion of multiple sovereignties is really complex. There was a moment, actually, when I think Native scholars were rejecting the idea of sovereignty. And of course, you know, Phil comes from a very distinguished family, you know, that brought forward, I think, this notion, but also from a very legal perspective. And so in the 1970s, what I witnessed is that I felt that we were really lagging in terms of making legal advances, and yet we needed to find ways to continue to empower ourselves. And so myself and other scholars like Robert Warrior began to expand the notion of sovereignty beyond the notion of a legal, just focusing on it from a monarchical legal perspective. And and so, underneath all of this, Ginger, is the idea that if we no longer maintain our discrete communities and cultures, then what uh, a dynamic struggle today, because everybody wants to be indigenous everywhere. And yet at some point there has to be some kind of response to the very traditions which inform the philosophies, this incredible inheritance that we've received. And so I do think that we're at this kind of moment where we need to constantly reproduce this knowledge. We need to be skilled and expert at reproducing it within a contemporary global context. But at the same time, it's really difficult to parse out what we need, how we need to continue it, uh, without getting caught up, I think, in maybe some uh, antiquated notions of nation state or antiquated notions of sovereignty. And so I'm constantly rewriting the definition of sovereignty because it's very fluid in our communities and has almost nothing a historic monarchical notion of sovereignty. And so, I mean, I think that this is, one of the biggest confusions around it, that, you have to constantly distance yourself from what that means and understand it as this emancipatory action in our communities. And I guess I would just add that I think, I find a great deal of tension in the in Jeffrey's work and also in the placement at the American Pavilion, because it really does bring up a number of questions about what our continued relationship is to the nation state. And, I think it's you know, uh, uh, a, an incredible accomplishment to be able to, uh, for Jeffrey to have achieved and also all of the commissioners to have achieved the opportunity to be in the biennial in this space. But, at some point, are there going to be indigenous spaces in the Venice Biennale that recognize our own nationhood or recognize our own discrete cultural formations? And I think, I think that's going to come, but it's nothing comes easily. Everything that, changes hard. And, my presentation this morning was just a small, elements of all of the change that our ancestors had to constantly stand up for. And so, I do think that, all the people that stood up for and put this forward, this is part of this change, that we're making our presence known, that we're not receding, that we're claiming space. And part of claiming space is also being able to define it. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
I mean, thanks, Jolene, as always. I mean, you're always right on point with this. And I think the sort of sense of like intellectual sovereignty from Robert Warrior, visual sovereignty, Jolene's sort of theorizations, these things are really important. There's a lot of indigeneity at the Biennale. I mean, I've only wandered around a little bit, but lots of places are trying to do this. It's really clear. And it raises this question about sort of like if everybody gets to be indigenous, suddenly what does that mean? I mean, we know that in many, North American tribal contexts, the word indigeneity is actually not a word of embrace because the word tribal is actually the word of embrace. and how we think about those things together, I think is always a challenge. I mean, for me, I think one of the central challenges that was, I mean, Jeffrey, I don't want to sort of like psychoanalyze you or guess, right? But I mean, how do you represent, I mean, was this to be an indigenous pavilion? Yes. Was it to be an American pavilion? Yes. How did those things get navigated, I think, is one of the sort of central questions. And, I mean, there's one way in which it imagines coming in and sort of like absolutely seizing control in a decolonizing, indigenizing kind of way. And I don't actually see the pavilion doing that. I mean, what I see the pavilion doing is sort of framing a kind of set of utopian American claims, right, which start as human rights claims, right? The right to be free, they start as human rights claims, human nature claims, or human claims, which are, in the American context, translated into political claims, right, through the Constitution, through the Declaration of Independence, right? There's a reason why so many documents, utopian American documents, and phrases are cited in the pavilion, right? And I think the reason is to sort of say, like, this was an articulation of a certain kind of nationalism based on a certain set of possible claims. And so one way to think about that would be like, let's celebrate that American thing, but that's obviously not what's going to happen here, because so much of this is concerned with the hurts of history that accompany those kinds of things. And so there's definitely a native claim here, right? I mean, I've written down, like, the returned male student too frequently goes back to the reservation and falls into the old custom of letting his hair grow long. The great spirit is in all things. We will be known forever by the tracks we leave, right? There's a super strong native presence here in terms of its visual sovereignty, but also in terms of its rhetorical sovereignty, right? The sort of claims about the hurts of history relative, right, to those American claims. But I think this is where for me, where the interesting kind of intervention happens, right, in the pavilion, which is, a native position on this would be a tribal national position, a kind of pushback against all those things and a rejection of all those things. But instead, I think what Jeffrey's done is to say those human rights claims became administrative claims, which then allowed other people to make the claims. And who are the people in American history who've made those claims? African American people, right, who have advanced a claim around sort of moving from slavery to freedom into a civil rights kind of framework, which is not a tribal sovereignty framework, and it's really important for us to make those distinctions. Right, but when we think about where the critiques come from, right, they come from Frederick Douglass, they come from Booker T. Washington, they come from Nina Simone, right, so these phrases are the ones that sort of put us in a kind of frame. So, I mean, what I see is this sort of an indigenous voicing of an African-American critique of American claims to authority on the basis of a human rights kind of, I mean, this is a long and complicated chain, but I think this is the space in which we have now been placed, right? Which is to say, this is a complicated, multidimensional kind of space, right? So to me, in a sense, it's like, I think Jolene's right. Like, this is not the indigenous pavilion we've been waiting for. It is the decentering of kind of white American pavilion by putting an Afro-Native conversation, right, into place, and that's a conversation that we have yet to develop. Really, but I think it's an invitation to that as a way of thinking through the hurts of history that are encapsulated in all of those different kinds of phrases.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, I definitely agree. And I wanted to just kind of bring in a little bit around, I guess, the ethos of the talk around labor and economics, and kind of pivot into that space a little bit. And the interest from the global art market towards indigenous art at this time is apparent, here we are. And Carolyn, you're an indigenous artist situated in the larger contemporary art world, and can you share a bit of your experience in relation to maintaining your studio practice as the demand for your work and ideas grow, and how other artists might also be navigating that?
So I come from the artist-run centers sectors, and got represented by a gallery starting 2018, a gallery in Montreal and Toronto, And when I got into that gallery, I was the only and first Indigenous artist within that roster of artists. And I've seen, and I advocated, I said, this is unrealistic. We're, 2022, it's already, if you want to be actual into the art market, you need to include Indigenous voices in your roster of artists. And since then, I've seen the growth, and they've included several other Indigenous artists now, because they've realized also that there's a market for it, but also it's original voices, it's vibrant voices. We have the energy, we're ready to work hard, and we bring people together, and we have a very strong network of people where we don't actually need them to get the work done. But I've noticed since getting into that gallery, I had to shift my production and my making to start thinking more into creating and producing objects, which has had an influence on the work that I've done, and having to sustain a demand for the work. Which is good. I had to hire a studio manager. I had to make that jump and have people help me, because I realized I was only doing administrative work and not doing any more creative work, which is, as an artist, the end of your passion. And it was difficult at the beginning, but it was the best thing I could do, because then I could structure things and I could respond to that demand. And nowadays, after 5 years of doing that jump, I now have 3 full-time assistants. And when we're in high production, we can be about 10 people working on an exhibition. So it has grown so much, so fast. And when you start off as an artist, they don't tell you that you will have to be an entrepreneur and hire people, and start respecting the people that you hire. So probably go put them on paychecks, payroll, and just have a structure for them, because these people have families and lives. So it comes with a great deal of responsibility to run a studio. And you have to just go and seek help. And I did that. I did a 1-year mentoring just to business owners, and to just make sure that I have accounting. I mean, I went into sociology and literature because I was bad at math. So, So now I have to look at all these numbers and what goes in, what all the production costs, and you need help. And I think that's what is about having a studio practice, is also getting the help and surround yourself with really invested people that have a common vision. And I don't believe in the lone artist being the genius. I'm very lucky to be surrounded by fantastic people that we have the common goal, and I don't feel I'm above them. I'm just the face of that needs to be in the world. But we come up with solutions together, and I have to work with consultant in architecture, or sound designers, or photographers, or just people that have greater skills than I do. And in the end, yes, it's my vision, but we find solutions together.
Ginger,
Jolene, do you have any reflections?
yeah, I'd like to add something. I mean, I think the study that needs to be done is to really look carefully at how all of our communities entered the market after our forced dispossessions. Because I would argue that it was actually the sale of our early, what people think of as customary or traditional art, that actually stabilized our communities financially when we were interned into reservation territories, because we were not, because of racism, we were not able to work in the kinds, or start businesses or get bank loans in, like in the Northeast. It would have been in the 1800s. The timeline shifts depending on the impact of your colonization. But the ability of our people to make things of beauty, things of interest, are actually what sustained us. And so, I mean, another way to think about this is that I recall in the 1980s, all of a sudden on the streets in the city of New York, I began to see amazing Guatemalan and Mayan weavings being sold on the street, and so sometimes I'm thinking about that, people's use their artistic creativity, imagination in situations of extreme, um, in extreme situations where there's nothing else to actually, uh, create an opportunity to survive. And so, a number of people, including Janet Burlow, have written about the notion of indigenous art as survival arts, right? And of course, this, Phil and I both mentioned, Visner's notion of survivance, but, it's 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 not just survivance or survival, but it's also that, this is where we teach ourselves how to be who we are in these kinds of statements and making. And so I think, Jeffrey's installation at uh, the Biennale this year is particularly poignant because, the bead and beadwork, I would argue, in Native communities in the past 30 years has completely changed and it's been revolutionized. And that, prior to this, artists were really focused on, in a sense, fitting in, two-dimensional or plastic arts, painterly works, sculptural works that conform to, perhaps one could argue a more Western notion of art making. And then something happened. People in our communities just really broke out and said, we're claiming our past and bringing it with us into this artistic statement. And so I do feel that, you know, this work, like all artworks, really does reflect a certain kind of moment in our consciousness, and that, it might not be, perhaps people might not really recognize the significance of it because they're really not thinking about the role of beadwork in our lives, or the role of beauty, or the role of this kind of aesthetic practice. But I think it's, it's central to our ongoing, not only economies, but also our ongoing construction of who we are as Native peoples.
You have something that you'd like to add on that sentiment, Phil or Caroline?
Well, it does. I mean, the reason I raised the trickster hermeneutic question, right, was both to sort of make fun of myself in the 80s, but also, and us as a field, but also to sort of think about the ways that, like, was that sort of sensibility kind of translated by Visner in the 90s into sort of a survivance, kind of aesthetic. And I mean, for me, one of the sort of interesting things that's been happening, I think, has been the reduction of the complexity of the idea of survivance into kind of survival resistance dialectics, right? And I think that's wrong. I think, Visner's sense of this, I mean, the reason he defines it in so many mysterious ways over and over and over again is because it's a thinking concept, right? It's a concept that's not ever finished, it's open, and open in the sense of the high theory dramas of the 80s and 90s, but also in the sense of sort of indigenous futurity and presentness and pastness in ways that I think, for me, the sort of innovation of that is to say, like, oh, if there's a kind of tricksterousness, a kind of a, however we want to define that, and that's probably a bracketed question, it is about the ways in which the post-Indian warriors of survivance actually see, perceive, understand what's happening in white markets, in white governance, right, and are able to sort of respond and interact within that, produce themselves as the new but also as the old, right? And I think this, what Jolene's talking about, to me, this explosion of beadwork also happens in all kinds of other aesthetic and expressive sorts of realms, and it runs directly counter to the sort of claim that, like, indigenous people are people of loss, right? And that there's a kind of declension narrative and, oh, we've lost so many things from back in the past. Because what is so striking about survivance for me as a concept and about these things is, like, those things actually are reclaimable, right? They are still there. They are entirely within the grasp of people, and is a fundamentally mysterious process, right? You can't theorize this through cultural theory and sociological structures and economic analysis to figure out how those things relive, right? How those things which have been asleep are actually awakened. But we see it happening all the time, right? So it's a real thing. It's a real phenomenon. Survivance for me is one way of thinking about that and talking about it. I think what Jolene's just framed is another. And the ways in which, you know, I mean, yes, beadwork in terms of, you know, kind of market and art in terms of market, but I think it's actually, Jeffrey, it goes to the conversation you and I had last summer, which is, you know, we ended up saying something like, if you sort of go to, say, Lakota country in the 1890s and look at the proliferation of beautiful beadwork, right? These are people at the brink, right? Who are actually investing much more time and energy than one would have ever imagined in producing beautiful things, right? For themselves, for the market, for posterity, but also just as a way of being and living. And it just seems to me like that's the spirit, right, of what we're talking about.
I also feel that there's an expectation of what Indigenous art should be. And especially in Francophone Canada, and in Europe, they tend to really romanticize and have a very clear idea of what it's supposed to be. And as soon as you move beyond that and go towards more abstraction, you're confronted with, in the market, let's say, where they would ask for works that are more iconic and reference maybe an older work that you've done. This happens to me recently where I moved away from a certain type of works and my gallery was saying, well, please do what you've been doing 2 years ago because that sells. And then the new work is clients are not really catching up to that. But as an artist, you don't want to be repeating what you were doing 2 years ago. You evolve as your ideas evolve and you evolve as a human being. So that's always really interesting to me, how they try to push you into a direction that fits the market.
Yeah, when I think about the title of this panel, Future Making, I think about the labor each of you put into your work, the amount of care, resource, and community it takes to be, to like activate and archive ideas to make future now, you know? And so within this future, perhaps economy becomes or may become an opportunity to practice like mutual aid, build global well-being. Perhaps we can even dismantle notions of capitalism within the arts and making a more equitable future together. And so I'm curious, like, what does future making mean for you each in the context of this conversation?
For me, I think I try to make work according to my own standards and my own ambitions. I don't want to make work for someone else. I make it for me first and for the people involved in creating the work. So that keeps me focused and assures that I can remain authentic with my own voice and my own intentions and where my spirit wants to lead me. I also think it's a labor of love. There's so much work being put in the work, and you have to really love what you do to be dedicated to that level. You have to love the people you surround yourself with, and I think when you're building community, it's through the work, it's about creating relationships. So it's not necessarily an economic gesture. Yes, you're, paying for the framer or for the person that does the embroidery or, the photographer, or you're hiring people, but you're especially building relationships. And these are people that you will work again and again through many projects. So you're growing together. And I think this is the idea of future making, is just finding different ways that is more inclusive. And I think working also outside of the Indigenous community, I have people in the studio that comes from all different backgrounds, and that's really wonderful to have them come into the studio and work on titles that are in Anishinaabe, and they're learning words and they're bringing that to their families at home, and they're learning about philosophies and stories and my own family history, and that creates a real understanding that I think it's beautiful. When I shot my first feature film, I brought an entire Quebec crew to my home community, my mom's community, and they stayed there for several weeks, and that was a real reconciliation building where they learn about each other and they work together for a common goal. And it was quite successful in that way.
Jolene, would you like to add anything around what future making means to you in the context of the conversation we're having?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Future making. I guess I'm at a really different place. You know, I've had an amazing journey. I've lived in London, Toronto, Ottawa, um, Ithaca, and of course, New York City. And I spend most of my time at Tuscarora now and within the Haudenosaunee territories. And so I felt that if I didn't put a shoulder in to stabilizing things within my own community and then the reverberations in the Confederacy at large, there wouldn't be a place for the next generation. And so the future making for me has been we've recovered the longhouse tradition at Tuscarora, of which, you know, my husband Tim has been a central part of. And I think throughout all of our territories, there's the next generation, most of the young people in the room right now are really deeply involved in language revitalization. And the so the way that I see it is that, you know, we do have this incredible inheritance of millennia of observational practice that we think of as our culture or cultures or customary practices. And we, you know, many of us have really begun that process of really valuing that experience and not, you know, while at the same time not rejecting what the pulse of the rest of the world, technologies, etc. I think that there's an interesting kind of and healthy integration of these very different systems. And I think, Ginger, you said it earlier. You said that the conference felt like an experience of love. And I think that, you know, there is a core of wellness in Indigenous philosophy that needs to really be brought forward in a world that has turned really in the most harsh ways to a kind of lack of respect for human life. And so, you know, because I come from the Haudenosaunee, and it's estimated that over 2,000 years ago, our people made a commitment to bury the implements of war and to seek a greater consciousness of peace. You know, this is kind of like the principles that I'm thinking about all the time. And so I do think that there's something that Indigenous peoples, I mean, it's such a bigger discussion about what future making is with Indigenous peoples, because you can't disconnect this discussion from the relationship to place, land, you know, the ethos of what those relationships are. And so, you know, I think we're just kind of at the cusp of this, but, you know, I mean, it's going to be a race against time in a sense in order to see what will prevail, you know, because within our philosophies, we don't really have philosophies of end narratives, but we do have philosophies of renewal. And there are some cultures in the world that actually think in terms of uh, apocalyptic ends, and that isn't us. And so, future making for us is this constant renewal. And you know, I'm not gonna, you know, I mean, there's a lot of other people that are much more that I really the people that get out there and talk about tradition. And, you know, I'm interested in the innovation of tradition. I'm not interested in the rhetoric of it. And so I guess maybe that would be how I would position it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jolene. That's beautiful to hear. Thank you. Phil, do you have anything to add?
Well, it's hard to follow Jolene with that beautiful sort of meditation, which I think gets to exactly the heart of it, right? I mean, that, you know, our futurity is linked to a larger kind of futurity, some of which we have little control over, but all of which we have something to say to speak to. And I think, you know, I mean, you know, for me, I mean, I just had to sign up for Medicare last year. You know, I'm hitting the end of my career, and in some ways, I'm finding it incredibly liberating. So in terms of practice, right? I mean, I'm very interested in sort of like taking history, that place where I sort of reside within the academy, and just kind of turning it inside out on itself, and sort of, so for me, the counterfactual, the sort of making up of things relative to actual historical facts and creating new kinds of what I think are new sort of narrative forms, which are historical and which sort of, but which twist into fiction and which end with claims which I think are historically valid, right? I mean, you know, it's like, even as I say that, I realize this is what people say about Donald Trump right now, right? That he's in the emotional register of the area of but in some ways, right? I mean, it speaks to the fact that like half of the country is still going to vote for Donald Trump, right? There's something about sort of like, how do we seize whatever is happening with that sort of narrative thing that he does, right? Can we actually leverage that, you know? So, I mean, so I feel really blessed to have had the chance to sort of experiment with this with, you know, Jeffrey in the Indigenous present, but also, you know, sort of, I've got a sort of spinning out of the Lenape, the Delaware Treaty of 1778. I've been sort of toying with, you know, Jesse Ed Davis and Rory Gallagher jamming in sort of anti-colonial sort of guitar kind of things. I've got a sort of fantasy about a janitor, a curatorial janitor in the Peabody Museum at Harvard University. Beth Piatot and I have talked a lot about these kinds of things. I'm a decolonial massage therapist. You know, I mean, so I'm just, I'm feeling like, you know, so one way that I want to think about sort of futurity is sort of to think like, can we take the forms and twist the forms and imagine new kinds of things? Is there a way for me as a writer to actually kind of not be a historian for a while? And I think that points to, like, for me, a couple of really, really important kind of places and ways for us to think about this. One is, I think, and it comes out of the, at least my reading of the Pavilion, which is sort of like, how do we think about sort of the solidarities of the people who have lived through the hurts of history? How do we think about sort of the treaty and the civil right, and you know, and how do we think about sort of building alliances? Because it feels to me like we've reached these sort of points where those things are really, really important questions, and we've got openings and opportunities that we haven't had in the past. And so I think that's one thing. And I think a second thing is sort of like, I mean, for me, this is a legacy of my dad, which is to sort of always deconstruct the kind of rigid Western categorical boundaries that prevent us from thinking in creative kinds of ways. So, you know, science, religion, no, let's not do that, right? Let's figure out ways to sort of take apart those things, get people to be thinking in different ways. And I think in a moment of sort of, you know, climate catastrophe, it's not just about managing climate catastrophe, it's about sort of driving at every front possible new ways of thinking about things. And it feels to me like it's a hopeless task, rolling the boulder up the hill of capitalism. And on the other hand, it's like you can't not try. And so, I mean, I think that's sort of my sense of things. And I think it speaks exactly to what Jolene was speaking about when we think about sort of native epistemological kinds of positions, philosophical kinds of positions that absolutely have things to say, right, to the here and now.
Yes, very kaleidoscopic. You know, I feel like even the way we got shuffled into this panel together, at first we were like, wow, all of our practices are so different, you know, but we come together and we're like, we are future making, you know, just by sharing ideas and our perspectives and finding a way to like build with one another. So I've really appreciated getting to know you all over the past few days and forming questions that we wanted to share between each other for the panel. And speaking of, we're going to have a little bit of time for a Q&A, so I'd like to open it up for the next 15 or so minutes if anybody wants to ask any of the panelists a question. Okay, we're going to hand the mic back. Thank you.
Okay, here we are. Thank you so much, everybody. Toward the beginning, Philip, you said something about the dreaming unconscious of Jeffrey's Pavilion, and that just stayed with me throughout the conversation, and something that I noticed coming up in everybody's contributions was this thinking about multiplicity and what is kaleidoscopic in practice, like Ginger just said. And you all spoke to experiences of rigidity and expectations of rigidity around practice, around concepts, around what you're doing as artists and art historians, practitioners. So I was curious about how, to me, that thinking about a dreaming of conscious, of something that's hard to specify, something kind of slippery and inherently kaleidoscopic. I'm curious about what an art historical practice, what a research practice, what an art practice looks like that can consider the dreaming unconscious, and what it looks like to honor that level without stifling it in a rigid way.
Everybody up here saying, that's for you. I mean, okay, so for me, you know, this goes to sort of an old school art historian, Janet Wolfe, meets Walter Benjamin. I mean, and Walter Benjamin dreaming that each epoch is dreaming the future of the next epoch that is to come. And Wolfe sort of like, at least this is my memory of this, art historians will correct me if I'm getting it wrong, I'm sure, right? This sort of sense that like when an artist actually speaks, an artist speaks with intent and with consciousness, but also with an unconsciousness, right? And that unconsciousness has all kinds of interesting things. And that we as people who are perceiving art also are perceiving it in intentional and interpretive, but also in conscious kinds of ways. And it feels to me like one of the interesting things for me, at least, in terms of, you know, observing art, is to sort of like bring, okay, an interpretive practice, fine, and I make sense of things, but also to recognize that there's an unconscious kind of communication that is flowing, that is going on there. And is it possible to imagine sort of the moments of therapeutic surfacing, right, where those things can actually become part of the conscious, right? And you know, so I'll just give you an example. For me, in terms of, I think the sculpture in front is super important, right? And the title of it is the place in which the space in which to place me. So I don't think that's by an accident. And I spent a lot of time sort of just staring at pictures of that and wondering about it before I actually saw it. And what surfaced for me over time, right, was this sort of distinction between this sort of, these are a bunch of pedestals, and this has a kind of pedestal sort of thing. But I also kind of started to realize like there's these plinths there as well, right? And suddenly, I mean, it started to strike me, and I don't know that I would attribute this to Jeffrey Gibson's conscious in intentionality, but it feels to me like a surface kind of thing, that there's a kind of pedestalic thing, right? And what happens with the pedestal? It's room for one, right? It's an elevation, right? It's an individualist kind of ethos, right? And so I look at that and I'm like, let's look at all those pedestals. And then suddenly I'm like, there's a few of those plinths in there as well, which are horizontal, which make room for multiple kinds of people, which are bases and supports. And suddenly I'm like, you know what? There's a kind of a collectivist thing that's happening here. And, you know, suddenly what surfaced for me then is the sort of dream unconsciousness of a kind of dialectical relationship between individual-ish stuff, right, and between collective kinds of things. And then immediately I'm thrown into saying like, okay, well the crude version of that is Americanness is individualism and Native stuff is collectivism. But we all know within Native cultures there's room for individual kinds of, right, there's room for the sort of the worlding and the sort of solidity and the reality and the power of the individual. And so it's like, it's actually not an Indian-American dialectic, though it is that. It is something deeper than that and more conscious. And I understand at this point that like, I'm kind of getting somewhere, but I also understand I haven't fully figured it out, and that there's stuff that's still happening, that's happening at the emotional and the affective level, at the level of the unconscious. And I think, like, in some ways, for me, that's the great, amazing joy about art, is the fact that like, the more you look at it, the more you see. And the more you're engaged with it, the more you know and the more you learn. And I think more of that is the surfacing. And I think some of the things which are surfaced can be incredibly profound. And not just subjectively profound, right, in terms of like, oh, and I thought of that thing, but like universal, profound kinds of things. I mean, that's why we do art, right? That's why in every one of these moments when things are so hard, people are still doing art. So, I mean, it feels to me like this kind of incredible brief for the thing that we all do here.
Thank you all very much for my head spinning. There was something yesterday that, there was a phrase that Jeffrey used yesterday that stuck with me, this notion of, he was looking forward to looking back at this moment. So this notion of this sort of future interior, right? The way in which the present is the future's past is really interesting to me. So even though we're thinking about future making, right, we're very solidly also thinking about the present. So I guess this is for Phil. When you were talking about the sort of the temporal aspect of the architecture of the pavilions, right? You were walking through Canadian pavilion, American pavilion. If you keep going down, you get to the Israeli pavilion. That when I first came in April to the opening, it struck me so much, the juxtaposing of those two buildings, you know, the neoclassical with this kind of very minimalist, modernist architecture. And that space between those structures is so narrow on so many ways. I'm wondering what you thought of when you encountered that juxtapositioning of those two structures, the colonial history, the very fraught present, the relationship between indigeneity in Palestine versus here in the U.S. So just thoughts about all of that.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, exactly, right. I mean, this is a moment in which the sort of our experience in being in space and moving in space and being in placed spaces, right, is nothing but not full of unconscious kinds of anxieties, terrors, tensions, uncertainties, pain, empathetic pain, right, for these different kinds of histories and for whether these things come back. You know, to us, the narrow gap between these things, you know, is of course suggestive, you know, in our present moment, but also I think deserving of historicization in terms of the ways in which the pavilion actually comes to be, and that's a history that I don't actually know. But I think it's also really striking to sort of think about the ways in which the sort of neoclassical colonial kind of frame sits in relation to kind of the, you know, kind of abstract Cubist. I mean, I think about Australia, you know, for example. It's really clear what happened in Australia. Every British colonizer who went to North America learned all their lessons, and they came and they applied them in the most devastating way to Australian Aboriginal people, right? I mean, and yet, you know, you've got this kind of cube which allowed Archie Moore to do things that I think, Jeffrey, you couldn't do, right, in a building that was much more constricted by a neoclassical gallery kind of setting, an open kind of cube, and you get this thing that kind of is mind-blowingly, you know, amazing. So, you know, how to think about this, how to talk about it, how to, you know, deal with the invocations of settler colonialism, the invocations of indigeneity. I mean, I wish I had an answer to this. I wish I had a kind of transparent sort of, you know, thing. I mean, we can all sort of stand up and make kind of declarative statements one way or the other. I actually don't feel that comfortable doing that myself. It's been interesting to me the ways that, you know, for example, in my dad's book, Behind the Trail. I spend a lot of time defending my dad. For those who know Red Earth, White Lies, I defend him around stegosauruses in the Missouri River and things like that. But I also defend him in other kinds of ways, and one of them has been this sort of accusation that because of 2 pages in that book where he's doing an analysis of what it took to be recognized by the United States as a nation state, was it being small or large? Was it being educated? Was it having a sort of per capita thing? There's 2 pages on Israel, right? And the recognition and the support of the United States of Israel. And suddenly my dad's a Zionist when in fact like he was not thinking in any way of those kinds of questions in 1973. So I think it's, for me, I don't feel capable, qualified, to sort of make a declarative statement on these kinds of things. But I think part of what we all need to do here is to hold this sort of sheer volume of devastation and death and pain that people are experiencing right now, in the here and now, understand the ways in which we as Americans are wholly and completely complicit in that.
I think that's a great answer. Like sometimes we can let art speak to us and bring out feelings that are complicated, and sometimes it's okay not to know all the time what the right answer is. And of course, we need to have the ability to imagine like freedom for Palestine, imagine freedom for all people who have gone through and will continue to go through genocide. And I think it's just really important to recognize I guess the economics of love, like it's funny how this panel is about some labor and economics, but I'm so emotional through this whole talk. Like I feel like there's something that we've forgotten to remember, and being with you all is reminding me of that. And sometimes we don't know, and we're asked to know all the time what exactly is the right way to feel when there's social media telling us how to feel all the time or what we should react to and how. But sometimes I think of like a lot of people in this room's ancestors who have traditions of beadwork, and how many thousands of hours they took to understand like a lazy stitch is not a lazy stitch. There's so much like dense understanding in that, and wisdom and knowledge, and making mistakes and clarifying through community. And so like we need to remember that we can be in control of time, and sometimes the answers don't always come quickly, but we're in community, and I really appreciate, especially as a scholar, to say I don't know, like I think we all need to say that more, I think we have time for one more question. If anybody has something for Carolyn or Jolene, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, I have a question for Caroline, but I'm going to actually use Phil's work to build to the question. And you referenced your second book, Indians in Unexpected Places, and in that you talk about how, as Native people, we've become really good at meeting these outside expectations and meeting the expectations of our own communities. And something that I noticed yesterday at the pavilion, a woman rolling out a sign that said, "Please don't climb on the structure," as these kids were, climbing on the structure. And I noticed them kind of like standing and like posing, and one of them like, showed how strong they were. And I noticed a connection there between that and your photographic practice that you were discussing, and the creation of, these kind of future imaginaries where women are seen in positions of power and taking up leadership roles, and kind of put on this pedestal that has not otherwise happened in our communities. Can you talk a little bit about kind of the power of like this kind of visibility and representation that I think is getting us beyond the politics of representation and toward this idea of seeing ourselves in spaces and being able to kind of take up that space that has otherwise been kind of foreclosed to us because we haven't had like that visual signal that, oh yes, I can do this, because museums have to date been filled with like white guys on horses.
Yeah, it is that these photographs are really about putting women back to a pedestal and really breaking away from what we see in the media. Often it's always presented as the victim, it's always black and white, and it's really not the women I know in my community, in my family. We're funny, we're resilient, we're colorful, we're so eccentric, and especially for someone like Alanis Obomsawin, who's 92 years old and arrives to a photo shoot wearing turquoise fishnet stockings. These are the type of women that I know in my surroundings, and they're proud to be this way, and it's important to celebrate that. When I do these photographs also, I always make it a celebration. I make a giant feast. I buy bottles of bubbly, and we share. After the photo is taken, we sit down and we share stories. We're all very busy in our respective lives, but that moment is sacred because we come together and we can exchange and share stories. And Alanis will start singing, and it's a way of passing down teachings as well, and transmission, and just sharing where we're at in our lives as women, Indigenous, and artists. And these series are started with a want to revisit important historical and artistic movements. Under the Indian Act in Canada, we were not able to practice our culture and art making. And I always imagine if we would have had that chance to explore surrealism or Dadaism at a time, what would it look like from an Indigenous perspective or Anishinaabe perspective? We have to catch up on such a rapid way to explore these movements and be allowed to make mistakes and create outside of what our own tradition. We can also we can also appropriate other movements. We can be interested by so many other things in a global context, and it's about allowing us to also do that.
Jolene, do you have anything to add to the conversation that Jamie Powell brought forward as we close? Oh, and you're muted. And also no pressure. I just wanted to open it for you one last moment.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Jamie. I thought Caroline and surrounded in her practice, and we should, celebrate that. So I'm going to let it stand there. Thank you.
Well, I think that that concludes our panel. I've really enjoyed getting to know Phil, Jolene, Carolyn. Thank you all so much for being in community, and I feel like we're bonded now for life. I love that, and just thank you all. I hope that. I hope that we can all find new ways to practice economics that isn't through capitalism, and maybe an Indigenous worldview will lead us. And I look forward to having more time with you all over the rest of the week. Thank you.